He was a millionaire. She was his pregnant wife. But when she needed him most, in a hospital bed, fighting for her and their baby's life, he was in Bora Bora with his mistress. What happened next shattered reputations, broke hearts, and changed lives forever. This is a raw, emotional story of betrayal, downfall, and the fight for redemption. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. The cold fluorescent lights of the emergency room buzzed faintly above Amara Wilson Harper as she sat hunched on the hard plastic chair, one hand cradling her swollen belly, the other gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her eyes, glassy with unshed tears, flicked from the clock on the pale green wall to the entrance doors every few seconds. Her husband should have been here by now. She breathed through the pain slowly, counting between the sharp tugs deep in her abdomen. The nurse had already told her they were most likely stress-induced contractions. Nothing serious, not yet. But the anxiety of being alone, combined with the sudden onset of cramping, had turned this routine checkup into something far more terrifying. Where was Daniel? Just that morning, he'd kissed her forehead and promised, "Don't worry, babe. I'll meet you at the hospital. Just a quick call with the investors." She had smiled, trusting him, because that's what she did. That's what she always did. Daniel Harper. The self-made tech millionaire who had once crossed the country on a red-eye just to surprise her on her birthday had always been there when it mattered. Until now. She looked down at her phone again. Still no message, no missed call, no nothing. Just a silence that was beginning to echo louder than any hospital monitor. Across town, 30,000 feet in the air, Daniel sipped chilled champagne from a crystal flute aboard a private jet bound for Miami. He was leaning back in the leather seat, legs crossed, laughing at something Sierra Lane had just whispered into his ear. Her lipstick was fresh, her perfume heady, and her designer dress slid off one shoulder like silk pouring over warm skin. She placed her manicured hand on his thigh with practiced intimacy. Daniel didn't flinch. He smiled. "I still can't believe you ditched the doctor's appointment," she purred. "For me." He shrugged as if it were nothing. "She'll be fine. It's a routine checkup. The baby's strong." He downed the rest of the champagne. "Besides, I needed a break. This deal's been choking me for weeks. Miami's exactly what I need to breathe again." Sierra leaned in closer, her lips brushing his earlobe. "To breathing, then?" Back in the hospital, Amara tried to shift positions, her lower back aching from the awkward chair. She pressed the side button on her phone again, even though the screen had already gone dark. She scrolled through her recent texts. "Amara, leaving now, we'll meet you there." "Daniel, read. I'll wrap this up quick." That was 2 hours ago. She closed her eyes and leaned her head against the wall. It wasn't just the pain or the waiting. It was the creeping realization that something was wrong. Not physically, though that worried her too, but deeper. Something between them had shifted lately, in ways she couldn't put a name to. He'd been colder, distant, and somehow always busy. Long meetings, last-minute flights, investor dinners that ended past midnight. He still smiled at her, still touched her stomach with apparent wonder, still said all the right things, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was performing more than living. The nurse came in again, this time with a clipboard and a kind smile. "Still no one with you?" she asked gently. Amara shook her head. "Well, your blood pressure's up. We want to keep you for observation for a few hours, maybe even overnight, just to be safe. I'll have someone bring you some ice chips." "Okay," Amara said, trying to keep her voice steady. Thank you." Once the nurse left, she let her facade crack for just a moment. Her eyes welled with tears. She wiped them quickly, part pride, part exhaustion. But it was too late. The weight was already sinking in. She was terrified, and Daniel, her husband, her supposed partner, was nowhere to be found. It hadn't always been like this. They'd met 5 years ago in a community college fundraiser, where she was working as a counselor and he was one of the early-stage tech sponsors looking to give back. He had been charming, sure, but not flashy, not yet. His startup was just taking off, and his suits were a little too big for him back then, but he'd spoken to her with warmth, not salesmanship. They had fallen fast. Dinner dates turned into weekend trips turned into moving in together. By the time he sold his second company and made his first million, Amara was already wearing the ring. Their wedding had been magical, held in a converted greenhouse filled with jasmine and white roses. Daniel had cried when she walked down the aisle. That memory was seared into her mind. The real him. Or, at least, the version she believed was real. Lately it felt like she was married to a hologram of that man, one who still looked the same but whose eyes had begun flickering elsewhere, whose attention drifted like a man constantly scanning the room for someone more interesting. She told herself it was the pressure, the business, the baby, anything but the possibility that he had grown tired of her. Oh. The truth, though, was harder to deny with each passing week. Daniel had changed after Sierra entered the picture. Amara didn't know her name yet, but she had felt her presence. Subtle at first, like perfume lingering in the hallway when Daniel came home late. Like the way he guarded his phone now, the way he started calling her babe instead of love. A term he'd once said reminded him of old songs and Sunday mornings. On the plane, Sierra flipped her camera and leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder. "Smile, handsome," she said. He smirked as the camera clicked. She tapped away quickly on her phone. Seconds later, the photo was posted to her story. "Quick getaway. He's all mine now." A cocktail emoji, a heart, a smirk. Amara's phone buzzed. It was Natalie, her best friend since high school. "Natalie, Amara, check Sierra Lane's IG right now. I think Daniel is with her." She stared at the message, heart pounding. Her fingers trembled as she tapped the app open. The photo loaded slowly, but when it did, the world seemed to tilt sideways. There he was, her husband, grinning with his arm wrapped around a woman with crimson lips and long lashes. The caption mocked her more than any scream ever could. Amara's body went cold. She couldn't breathe. Her baby kicked hard, as if sensing her panic, and Amara clutched her belly, trying to calm both herself and the tiny life within. A wave of nausea swept over her. She bolted upright, pressing the call button for the nurse with frantic urgency. When help arrived, Amara was gasping, her skin pale, and her blood pressure dangerously high. "We need to move her," the nurse said to the aide. As she was wheeled into a private monitoring room, Amara's mind spiraled. It wasn't just the betrayal. It wasn't just the photo. It was the terrifying thought that she and her baby were not just abandoned emotionally, they were physically alone in a moment of true crisis. Daniel had chosen someone else. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. And she was on her own now. The nurse placed sensors around her belly, monitoring the baby's heartbeat. It was steady, for now. But the stress wasn't helping. "You need to rest," the doctor told her gently. You and your baby are stable, but we're keeping you overnight. Absolutely no stress. Do you understand?" Amara nodded silently, but her thoughts screamed, "No stress. What a joke." Somewhere in the clouds, Daniel Harper sipped another glass of champagne, unaware that the empire he thought he'd built on love, success, and secrecy was already starting to crumble, brick by deceitful brick. Daniel Harper wasn't always the kind of man who would leave his pregnant wife alone in a hospital to chase a thrill in Miami. At least, that's what he liked to believe. Once he had been the dreamer, with a cracked phone screen and an overstuffed backpack, pitching app ideas at hole-in-the-wall coffee shops in downtown Detroit. He grew up in a neighborhood where boarded windows outnumbered flower pots, where ambition was often swallowed whole by circumstance. But Daniel had a fire in him, a need to escape, to build something no one could ever take away. He wasn't going to survive. He was going to win. By the time he was 35, he had sold his second company for 8 figures and made the cover of Innovator Weekly. His journey from public housing to penthouse status became legend in tech circles. Podcasts quoted him, college students reposted his hustle reels. Investors invited him to speak on stages with backlit LED signs that read, "Self-Made CEO." He walked those stages in tailored suits and glossy shoes, every detail calculated, polished, immaculate. But somewhere along the way, that gritty resilience began to twist into something else, something shinier, colder, more self-serving. Success didn't just inflate Daniel's bank account, it inflated his sense of entitlement. At first, he was still grounded by Amara. Her presence was a lighthouse, a place to return to when the tides of ego and expectation threatened to sweep him under. She had loved him when all he had were half-baked ideas and promises scribbled on Post-its. Back then, he had driven 4 hours just to see her for 15 minutes, sneaking onto her apartment balcony with takeout and a bottle of cheap red wine. They had made love with the windows open, dreaming of a life far bigger than their reality. She was his North Star. But as the zeros multiplied, Daniel began orbiting something else entirely. Status. The first real shift happened after a high-profile acquisition. Daniel walked out of the deal with a $42 million payout and a contact list that included celebrities, pro athletes, and politicians. Suddenly, people who had once ignored him at networking events now tripped over themselves to hand him their business cards. He traded beer nights with college friends for rooftop parties sponsored by tequila brands. Amara tried to keep up. She attended the galas, smiled through the awkward small talk, and nodded along when people asked what it was like to be married to a tech genius. But she never fully fit in with the crowd who measured worth in stock options and private jet hours. She didn't care about prestige. She cared about people. That was part of what made her so special, and part of what made her invisible in Daniel's new world. He would have never admitted it out loud, but Daniel had begun to see Amara as a relic of his past life, like the college hoodie he kept in the back of the closet. Sentimental, sure, but not something you wear in public anymore. She was comfortable, safe, predictable. Sierra Lane, on the other hand, was anything but. He met her at a product launch in Midtown. She wasn't even on the guest list. She'd come with a lifestyle blogger Daniel barely knew, gliding into the room like she owned the building. Sierra had that kind of beauty that made time pause, a symmetry so precise it felt engineered. Long waves of honey blonde hair, legs that curled at the corners like a dare, and legs that didn't seem to end. But it wasn't just her looks. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had learned early on that beauty wasn't a gift. It was currency. Daniel noticed her the moment she walked past the bar. She didn't notice him right away, or at least she pretended not to. Later that night, after speeches and photos, after he'd shaken too many hands and posed for too many cameras, he found himself in a quiet corner of the rooftop terrace. The city sparkled below them, glass and steel and promise. That's when she approached. "You look like you hate your own party," she said, her voice smoky with amusement. He chuckled. "I prefer building things, not celebrating them." Sierra tilted her head, sipping from her glass. "Maybe you just need better reasons to celebrate." They talked for 20 minutes, then an hour. She asked smart questions about his company, questions most people never bothered with. She listened, leaned in, laughed at all the right moments. And when she left, she didn't give him her number. She just slipped a business card into the breast pocket of his suit with a wink. He found himself staring at that card the next morning. It was matte black with embossed gold letters. Sierra Lane, Media and Influence Consultant. He didn't need a consultant. But curiosity won. Their lunch a few days later felt harmless, just conversation, a break from the high-stakes meetings. She wore a crisp white dress that clung to her like it had been sewn there. Her perfume lingered after she hugged him goodbye. Then came the texts, then a drink in a dimly lit lounge, then a kiss. He didn't stop. And just like that, the affair bloomed in the shadow of his marriage. Daniel told himself it was temporary, a distraction, nothing serious. He loved Amara, didn't he? Of course he did. He was just under pressure. He needed release, escape, just for a while. But Sierra was a drug, addictive, intoxicating, dangerous. She knew exactly how to stroke his ego, how to make him feel like the alpha in every room. With her, he wasn't just Daniel the CEO, he was untouchable. A god. It didn't take long for Sierra to start pushing boundaries, suggesting weekend trips, booking suites at resorts under fake names, whispering dreams of a life together, free from complications. She never demanded, just planted ideas. "Why keep hiding me?" she asked one night, sprawled on a hotel bed. "You're a king. Act like one." Daniel laughed, but her words lodged somewhere deep. He had built empires, closed billion-dollar deals, bought buildings with his initials carved in granite. Why was he still afraid to reach for what he wanted? Back home, Amara was decorating the nursery. She sent him pictures of tiny booties and pastel bedding. He responded with thumbs-up emojis and distracted affirmations. The guilt, when it came, was fleeting. He had grown too used to compartmentalizing, too good at telling himself he could handle both worlds. But the truth was, one world was already bleeding into the other. He began canceling plans, missing doctor visits, making excuses. When Amara asked if everything was okay, he kissed her forehead and told her she was overthinking. When she asked if he still loved her, he laughed and said, "Of course I do. Don't be silly." What he didn't say was that love, for him, had become conditional, an equation of effort and reward. And Amara, in her quiet stability, no longer gave him the rush he craved. Sierra, meanwhile, was escalating. She had moved into a high-rise with a view of the Hudson. Daniel helped with the down payment. She posted cryptic captions, half-naked photos, and tagged vague luxury locations. She was building a brand off the back of their affair, and he didn't even realize it. The weekend before the hospital incident, she brought up Miami. "You deserve a real break," she said, brushing her fingers over his chest. "Let's just disappear. A few days. I booked the jet already." He hesitated. "Mara has a checkup?" Sierra rolled her eyes. "You're not the OB. You'll be back before anything happens. Unless—" She trailed off, her smile sharpening. "Unless you're scared she'll figure it out." Daniel stared at her, something tightening in his chest. Not fear, ego. The insinuation that he wasn't in control. He made the call an hour later, told Amara he had to meet with a board member. "I'll meet you at the hospital after," he promised. She believed him. As the plane lifted off, he gazed out the window, letting the clouds swallow his conscience. Sierra leaned into him, all curves and ambition, and he let himself believe, for one fleeting moment, that he could live in both worlds forever. But even kings fall. And Daniel Harper was about to learn that the higher the pedestal, the harder the crash. The nursery smelled like fresh paint and lavender linen spray. Soft yellows and creams wrapped the room in a quiet kind of joy, hope in tangible form. Amara stood barefoot near the crib, smoothing the blanket with one hand, her other resting absent-mindedly on her belly. The baby kicked lightly, as if agreeing with her choices, and she smiled for the first time that week. It had taken her the better part of 3 days to arrange the room just right. She'd picked every detail with care. The mobile of tiny clouds and stars above the crib, the rocking chair near the window, the bookshelves already lined with children's stories and plush toys. But no matter how serene the room looked, something restless buzzed beneath the surface. She hadn't heard from Daniel in almost 12 hours, not since the Miami trip. He had returned, briefly, arriving late in the evening with a bag that looked suspiciously unused. No tan, no fatigue, no explanation. Just a quick kiss on her forehead and a vague comment about delays and networking chaos. Then, almost immediately, he had disappeared again for another meeting. Something wasn't right. Amara could feel it in her bones. It wasn't just the missed appointments or sudden flights. It was the way he looked through her instead of at her. The way his eyes no longer lingered on her swollen stomach with wonder, but darted past as though it were a mirror he didn't want to face. She tried not to panic. She told herself to breathe. That marriage had ebbs and flows, and pregnancy changed things. Maybe he was overwhelmed. Maybe he was trying to figure it out in his own way. But doubt had a way of growing like ivy. Slow, quiet, invasive. That evening, Amara sat in the living room, her feet propped up on a pillow, a parenting book open in her lap, though she wasn't reading a word of it. Her phone buzzed with a message from Natalie. "Natalie, hey, I saw something. I think you should see it too." Attached was a screenshot from social media. The handle belonged to Sierra Lane. The image was of a candlelit dinner, ocean waves in the background and 2 glasses clinking mid-tack, but it was the caption that made Amara's stomach twist. To taking chances and living freely. No more hiding. His and hers Miami nights. No tags, no faces. But Amara wasn't stupid. Her hand trembled as she scrolled through Sierra's public feed. Photos in mirrored elevators, designer luggage next to a private jet. One image of a man's hand resting on the curve of her back. Just his cuff and watch visible. But Amara recognized that watch. She had given it to Daniel for their 2nd anniversary. It was custom engraved. She stared at it for a long time. The room around her went muffled, the air sucked out. She tried to take a deep breath, but it caught in her throat. The baby kicked again, this time harder, as if trying to jolt her awake. Amara stood slowly, walked to their bedroom, and sat at Daniel's side of the bed. She picked up his tablet. He always left it charging on the nightstand, assuming she'd never look. Her fingers hesitated before tapping it on. The screen blinked to life. No password. A slow, bitter smile curled on her lips. He really thought she'd never suspect. She opened his messaging app. The thread was near the top. Sierra? Still dreaming about last night. When are we doing our next escape? Also, you left your toothbrush. Guess I'll keep it here. There were dozens of messages like that. Photos, too. Some of her in lingerie. Some of her lounging poolside with a glass of champagne. Some of the two of them, their faces close, grinning, oblivious to consequence. Amara's hand flew to her mouth, the bile rising fast. She dropped the tablet on the bed like it had burned her. She didn't cry. Not yet. Not even when the door clicked open an hour later and Daniel walked in, like nothing had happened. "Hey," he said, setting his keys on the counter. "You okay?" She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I saw the messages." He froze. "What?" "I saw everything," she said, voice steady. "Sierra, the photos, the trips." Silence stretched between them, like wire pulled too tight. Amara, I can explain," he began, taking a step forward. "No, Daniel, you really can't." He stopped. She could see the panic start to rise in his eyes, the twitch in his jaw, the way he rubbed the back of his neck, like he always did when caught off guard. "It didn't mean—" "Don't," she snapped, sharper than she intended. Her breath caught again. "Please, don't insult me." He didn't speak for a moment, just stood there, shifting uncomfortably. "You've been lying to me for months, haven't you?" she asked, her voice quieter now but no less cutting. "All those business trips? All those late meetings? I didn't plan for this to happen," he said finally. It happened." "And what exactly happened, Daniel? Did you trip and fall into her bed?" He flinched. She watched him closely, trying to see if there was even a glimmer of the man she used to know. The one who once wrote her poems on napkins, who built her a bookshelf because she said she missed her childhood ones, who cried the first time she showed him a positive pregnancy test. But that man, whoever he was, felt like a ghost now. "I should have told you," he muttered. She let out a hollow laugh. "Yeah, you should have." Daniel took a tentative step closer. "But I still love you." That was the moment her heart fractured. Not because he said it, but because she knew it wasn't true. "No, you love the idea of me," she said, "the version of me that fits neatly into your narrative. The supportive wife, the beautiful, pregnant centerpiece for your perfect life. But you don't love me. Not really. Because if you did, I wouldn't be sitting here with our daughter inside me, wondering how I ever became so disposable." His face crumpled. He opened his mouth again, but she held up a hand. "I'm tired, Daniel. I'm exhausted. I've been carrying your child and this entire marriage on my back while you chase God knows what with a woman who's selling your soul for followers. I'll end it," he said quickly. "Whatever it takes. I'll fix this." Amara stared at him, her voice suddenly soft. "You already broke it." The tears finally came after he left. She locked herself in the bathroom, sat on the cool tile floor and cried until her body shook. Not just for the betrayal, but for the loneliness. The future she had imagined, a family, a home full of laughter and lullabies, was slipping through her fingers like water. But amid the heartbreak, something else bloomed. She wasn't going to let this destroy her. She wouldn't crumble under the weight of his lies. She had a baby to protect, a life to build. And if Daniel Harper thought she was going to sit in silence and watch him walk away with everything, he was wrong. The next morning she called Natalie. Then she called a lawyer, and for the first time in months, Amara felt like she could breathe. She may have been broken, but she was not beaten. The sun had barely risen when Daniel rolled out of bed in Sierra's high-rise apartment overlooking Biscayne Bay. The sheets were tangled. The champagne bottle from the night before was still sweating on the nightstand, and Sierra lay sprawled across the mattress like a magazine centerfold, her blonde hair cascading in waves, lips slightly parted. She was beautiful. No one could deny that. But there was something about the way she slept, with no trace of vulnerability, that left Daniel feeling oddly unsettled. He stood at the window, staring at the shimmering horizon. The water was calm, almost too calm, as if mocking him. He checked his watch. 6:12 a.m. He knew Amara's appointment was at 9. Part of him had planned to be back in time, to fly in and meet her at the hospital like nothing had happened. But that part of him, the part tethered to responsibility, had grown faint, drowned out by the noise of excuses and Sierra's constant whispering that he deserved more. The night before, she had convinced him to extend the trip. "Just one more day," she'd said, her voice sugary sweet. "You need to relax, Daniel. You've been carrying the world on your back." And he'd believed her, or at least wanted to. He wanted to believe that this escape was necessary, that it was harmless, that Amara would understand. What he hadn't expected, what he couldn't have known, was that Amara had been rushed to the hospital just hours after he stepped onto the tarmac in Miami. Back in Chicago, she had collapsed while stepping out of the shower. The dizziness she had brushed off as dehydration came back with a vengeance. Her legs gave out, her vision blurred, and the last thing she remembered was clutching the edge of the bathroom counter before everything faded to black. Her neighbor heard the crash. The ambulance arrived within minutes. When she woke up, she was in a hospital gown, monitors beeping steadily around her, an IV in her arm, and a nurse adjusting the straps of the fetal monitor across her stomach. She blinked, disoriented. Her first instinct was to reach for her phone. No messages from Daniel. She asked what time it was. "Just past 10, the nurse answered. "You had a bad fall, but we're keeping a close eye on both of you." Her pulse quickened. "The baby?" The nurse gave a calming smile. "The baby's okay, but your blood pressure is high, dangerously high. The doctor suspects preeclampsia. You'll need strict monitoring, rest, and absolutely no stress." Amara swallowed hard. She didn't have the heart to explain that stress had become her constant companion lately. She sent Daniel a message. "I fainted. I'm at Lakeside General. Baby's okay. But I'm scared. Please come." No response. She waited. Minutes became an hour. Her fingers trembled as she dialed his number. Straight to voicemail. The nurse returned with a warm blanket and a cup of ice chips. "Any family we can call?" "My husband," Amara whispered. He said he had a meeting. He's probably just delayed." But even as she said it, her throat tightened. 2 floors below, in the hospital's family waiting area, Amara's mother had just arrived. Veronica Wilson was a retired nurse, and she didn't need charts to see her daughter was under immense strain. Her eyes, always gentle, now flashed with concern as she hugged Amara. "Where's Daniel?" she asked softly. Amara didn't answer. Her voice cracked when she finally said, "I don't know." Veronica didn't push. She simply sat beside her daughter and held her hand, brushing her curls away from her forehead. "You're not alone. You hear me? You are not alone." Amara nodded, biting back tears. In Miami, Daniel was lounging by the pool, a pair of sunglasses shielding his eyes from the morning sun. Sierra was in the water, laughing as she posed for photos with a friend who had joined them the night before. Music drifted from hidden speakers, the kind that cost thousands to install and blended seamlessly into the landscape. Daniel checked his phone. 1 missed call, 3 unread texts. His heart skipped. Amara? He opened the messages. He read the one about the hospital. His chest tightened. "Hey, everything okay?" Sierra called, wading through the water toward him. He didn't answer. He stood abruptly, grabbing his towel. Sierra frowned. "Where are you going?" He didn't look back. "I need to make a call." He found a quiet corner by the bar, heart racing. He tried to call her. No answer. He left a voicemail, trying to sound calm, apologetic. "Amara, I just got your message. God, I'm sorry. I didn't know. Are you okay? I'll be on the next flight back." But as he spoke, a deep guilt rooted itself in his gut. Not just for missing the appointment, but for the web of lies he had spun so tightly, he now couldn't find the ends to untangle it. In the hospital, Amara finally turned her phone off. She didn't want to hear it. Not now. Not while her baby's future hung in the balance. The doctor had warned her. Elevated blood pressure meant she had to avoid stress at all costs. That included Daniel. She closed her eyes, listening to the rhythmic blip of the fetal monitor, the soft hum of machines, and the faint voice of her mother humming a lullaby she used to sing when Amara was little. It was the first time in days she'd felt even remotely safe. But as the hours passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was permanently broken. The next morning she was released with strict instructions, complete bed rest, regular monitoring, weekly checkups. Veronica insisted she come home with her. No arguments. That penthouse is too quiet and too high up. You need ground under your feet. Amara didn't fight her. Later that day, while packing a bag from the penthouse, she noticed something missing. Daniel's favorite watch. His suitcase. A few of his shirts. The pieces clicked together like a cruel puzzle. The trip hadn't been business. It had been a vacation, an escape. With her. Amara sat on the edge of the bed, breath shallow. She pulled up Sierra's Instagram one more time, just to confirm what she already knew. A new post. Daniel, sunglasses on, laughing. Behind him, the ocean. The caption read, "No regrets, my person." Amara dropped the phone like it had electrocuted her. She couldn't breathe. Her body trembled with rage, betrayal, and fear. For her health, for her child, for everything that used to be sacred between them. Her mother walked in and saw the look on her face. One glance at the screen was enough. Veronica didn't say, "I told you so." She just sat down and wrapped her arms around her daughter as Amara sobbed against her chest. When Daniel returned 2 days later, the penthouse was empty. No Amara, no baby clothes, no soft scent of lavender, just silence. He wandered the rooms, calling her name, hoping she had left a note, hoping there was still a version of her that would forgive him. There was none. Only an echo, only consequence. And for the first time in years, Daniel Harper of power, of charm, of influence, felt utterly and completely alone. The penthouse felt colder without her. Daniel stood in the center of the living room, the late afternoon sunlight casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. The silence was suffocating. No music playing from the Bluetooth speakers, no sound of Amara humming softly in the kitchen while slicing fruit, no scent of cinnamon tea or warm vanilla candles. Just the lingering emptiness of everything he'd abandoned. He hadn't told Sierra he was coming back early. She thought they were going to extend the trip through the weekend. She was still at the resort, likely sipping cocktails and taking selfies by the pool. He hadn't even said goodbye. He'd booked the first flight back, heart pounding the entire way. But now that he was home, he realized he'd returned to nothing. He wandered through the rooms like a man trapped in a dream. The nursery door was half open, and he pushed it gently. Inside, the crib was gone. The mobile he had once helped Amara hang, a handmade set of stars and clouds she'd found at a craft market, was missing. Only the faint ring where the mobile had spun above remained, a ghost of motion, a reminder of the life he'd walked away from. A single stuffed giraffe sat alone in the corner. He crouched and picked it up. It still smelled faintly like the lavender sachets Amara used to tuck into drawers. And then he noticed the envelope on the dresser. It was addressed to him in Amara's handwriting. Elegant. Steady. Daniel hesitated before opening it. Daniel, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Don't worry, we're safe. I've gone to stay with my parents. The doctors have ordered strict bed rest, and I won't risk my health or our babies to wait around and hope you remember what commitment means. I gave you chances to tell the truth. I looked past the missed calls, the perfume on your shirt, the sudden meetings. I wanted to believe you, Daniel. God, I wanted to believe the man I married was still in there. But when I saw the photos, I knew I'd been lying to myself. You made a choice. And now, I'm making mine. Don't try to contact me directly. If you have anything to say, you can go through my attorney. Amara? Daniel sat down on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling. His throat tightened, but no sound came out, not even tears. Just a growing weight in his chest, as if someone had filled his lungs with wet cement. The doorbell rang. For a moment, he didn't move. Who could possibly be showing up now? He walked to the door and opened it to find a woman in a navy pantsuit, her expression cool and professional. She handed him a folder. Mr. Harper? I'm Monica LeClaire. I represent your wife. Consider this formal notice of legal separation and a petition for full custody. He blinked. Wait, what? Everything you need is in there, she said, motioning to the envelope. Your wife is seeking spousal support, child support, and immediate legal protections due to abandonment during a medically critical time. You've been served, Mr. Harper. He opened his mouth, but she was already turning away. Her heels clicked down the hallway like punctuation marks to a sentence he didn't understand yet. Daniel closed the door and leaned against it, the folder heavy in his hands. Legal separation. Full custody. He flipped through the documents, skimming over the words like they belonged to someone else. Terms. Witness statements. Evidence. There were screenshots of the photos from Bora Bora, printed out in color, mocking him with every pixel. Messages between him and Sierra, social media posts, time-stamped records of missed appointments and emergency room reports. They had built a case while he was drinking champagne and smiling for the camera. He dropped the folder onto the coffee table, the pages spilling out across the glass. The baby. His baby. Amara hadn't even let him see the sonogram after that appointment he missed. He hadn't asked. He'd been too caught up in the whirlwind of his double life to notice what was slipping through his fingers. He poured himself a drink, something dark and expensive, and downed it in one gulp. By the next morning, the news had broken. Daniel's assistant called him in a panic. "You need to see this." The tabloids had picked up the story. Tech tycoon's wife hospitalized while he vacations with mystery woman. There were photos of him and Sierra, poolside in Bora Bora, laughing like they hadn't a care in the world. There were other headlines, too. CEO Daniel Harper's picture-perfect marriage crumbles amid affair allegations, and Harper Industries under fire as investors pull back amid personal scandal. He clicked through them in disbelief. The comments were brutal. Another rich man throwing away a good woman. She deserves better. He's done. Watch. He felt sick. The next investor meeting was scheduled for Monday. His calendar was filled with calls that he suddenly had no desire to take. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Shareholders, board members, reporters, even former colleagues. He ignored them all. He texted Sierra, "We need to talk. Don't post anything else." She responded with a selfie in a robe and a pout. "Why? You embarrassed of me now?" He didn't answer. When Monday came, he walked into the boardroom at Harper Industries like a man preparing for trial. Ryan Blake, his COO, was already there, flanked by the legal team and 3 of their most powerful investors. The air was heavy with tension. "We're in a PR nightmare, Daniel," Ryan said flatly. "Clients are calling for refunds, partnerships are collapsing. You think this scandal is just personal? It's costing us millions." Daniel tried to respond, to explain, but no one wanted apologies. They wanted leadership, action, clarity, and he had none to give. By the end of the meeting, he had been stripped of his operational control. The board voted to appoint an interim CEO while personal matters were sorted out. Daniel walked out in a daze. He went back to the penthouse, but it no longer felt like home. The walls were too white, too clean. Every framed photo of him and Amara felt like an accusation. He picked one up, her laughing, head thrown back, eyes sparkling as he kissed her cheek at their baby shower. She looked happy, safe, loved. He placed the frame face down. When Sierra showed up that night, he didn't let her in. "I'm done," he said through the intercom. "What the hell are you talking about?" she snapped. He didn't answer. She banged on the door. "I stood by you. I supported you. I gave up everything for you." "You gave up nothing," he said. "And I lost everything." He didn't wait for her response. He turned off the intercom and walked away. The next few days passed in a fog. He stopped answering calls. His bank accounts froze. Lawsuits were filed. The penthouse was listed quietly, and a real estate agent showed it twice while he sat on the balcony, staring out over a city that had once worshipped him. He received word from Monica that Amara was still on bed rest, that the baby was stable for now, but that she didn't want to speak to him, not until the lawyers were done, not until she felt safe again. Daniel nodded. There was nothing left to say. He had made his choice. And now, alone in the penthouse with his empire crumbling around him, he began to understand the cost of everything he thought he wanted. Daniel sat at his office desk with his head in his hands, eyes bloodshot from days of sleepless nights and panic-fueled coffee. The once bustling corner office of Harper Industries, panoramic windows, walnut floors, art from up-and-coming New York painters, felt like a tomb now. The silence was deafening. Only the occasional buzz of his phone reminded him that the outside world still existed and, more specifically, that it was crumbling all around him. His team was falling apart. Ryan Blake had stopped taking his calls after the board vote. His legal counsel was fielding half a dozen lawsuits, including one from a VC partner accusing Daniel of misrepresentation during a pitch. Worst of all, the media storm had only grown louder. New outlets were running exposés on his personal life, digging into every detail of his affair with Sierra. She wasn't helping either. Quite the opposite. After he cut her off, Sierra had retaliated the way she knew best, with attention-grabbing drama. She gave an exclusive interview to a gossip channel, claiming she was tricked into loving a man who promised to leave his wife and that she feared for her emotional well-being. Her crocodile tears made the headlines splash even harder. Seduced, lied to, left behind. The mistress speaks out. Daniel nearly crushed his phone when he saw the article. He could have sworn he heard something inside him crack, but none of it compared to the message he received that Thursday afternoon. It came from Linda Parker, Amara's attorney. Simple, clean, devastating. Your daughter may be born early. Amara has been admitted again. The doctors are doing everything they can. She asks that you not come unless invited. He read the message 3 times before it fully registered. His daughter. Amara. The hospital. Suddenly nothing else mattered. The lawsuits, the media, the betrayal, all of it faded into white noise. He shoved his chair back, grabbed his coat, and ran out of the building. No driver, no assistant. Just Daniel and his own trembling hands on the steering wheel, racing through traffic toward Lakeside General like a man possessed. Every red light felt like an insult from the universe. He muttered apologies to no one and everyone, his palms sweaty against the leather. He thought of Amara, lying alone in a sterile room, monitors beeping, tubes in her arm, scared and hurting. He thought of their daughter, tiny and fragile, not even born yet, but already being failed by the man meant to protect her. By the time he arrived, the waiting room was already packed. Amara's parents were there, her father with arms crossed like a wall, her mother with eyes puffy and red-rimmed. A couple of Amara's old friends from work sat near the window. They all looked up when Daniel entered. Silence fell. He felt their stares like knives, condemnation etched into every wrinkle and line on their faces. Before he could speak, a voice stopped him. Daniel. He turned. Linda stood in the hallway, clipboard in hand, expression unreadable. I need to see her, he said, almost breathless. Linda hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She's asked for you. Come with me. That sentence nearly buckled his knees. They walked in silence, the air between them thick with all the things that didn't need saying. As they reached the labor and delivery suite, Linda stopped him. Don't say anything that'll stress her, she said quietly. She's in enough danger already. Daniel nodded and stepped inside. Amara lay in bed, sweat-damp hair plastered to her forehead, her hands gripping the side rails like she was holding herself to this earth with sheer force. The monitors beeped in chaotic rhythm. Her gown was soaked with perspiration, and her face was a storm of exhaustion, pain, and emotions too tangled to name. When her eyes met his, Daniel saw it all. Anger, betrayal, hurt, but layered underneath was something else. A trembling, fragile hope. I'm here, he whispered, stepping closer. She didn't speak. She just looked at him as another contraction twisted through her body. She gasped, teeth clenched, and Daniel instinctively reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. she whispered between breaths, tears slipping down her cheeks. "But I need you right now. She needs you." He swallowed hard, nodding, tears burning behind his eyes. "I'm here. I swear. I'm here." The hours that followed were the longest of his life. Amara labored into the night, and Daniel stayed by her side, wiping her brow, whispering encouragement, pressing her hand to his lips when the pain made her cry out. Nurses moved in and out with quiet urgency. The doctor gave updates that neither of them fully processed. Time twisted into a surreal blur of fear and anticipation. And then, finally, their daughter arrived. A soft, desperate cry pierced the room as the doctor held up a tiny, trembling baby girl. She was so small, too small. Her skin a delicate shade of pink. Her lungs barely able to voice her presence in the world. The team moved quickly, whisking her away to the NICU, their voices low but tense. Amara collapsed back onto the bed, drained and pale, her eyes fluttering shut. Daniel stood frozen, a cold sweat soaking his back. He looked at the empty spot where their daughter had been, then back to Amara, and something inside him cracked open. It was as if the armor he'd built around his ego finally shattered under the weight of real life, raw, terrifying, unfiltered. For the next 3 days, he didn't leave the hospital. He slept in the visitor's chair, he barely ate. He ignored every phone call, even the ones from his lawyer and the desperate messages from Sierra, trying to salvage her reputation now that the world saw her for what she was. He didn't care. The only thing that mattered was Amara and their baby girl, Charlotte. The first time they let him see Charlotte through the NICU glass, he stood motionless for almost 10 minutes, watching her tiny chest rise and fall under tubes and wires. She looked impossibly small, fragile as tissue paper, and yet she was fighting. That was the moment it hit him. What he'd almost lost. What he'd so carelessly gambled away. When he finally returned to Amara's room, she was sitting up, weak but awake, staring out the window at the early morning fog. "I saw her," he said softly. She's beautiful." Amara didn't respond right away. Then, without turning, she whispered, "Is this who you want to be, Daniel? A man who only shows up after everything's broken?" He took a breath, steadying himself. "No. I don't want to be that man anymore." She finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were sharp, swollen with exhaustion, but unflinching. "You already are." He nodded, accepting the blow. "I know." A long pause. "I'm not doing this for us," she said. "I'm doing it for her. Charlotte deserves 2 parents who show up. But that doesn't mean I'll ever trust you again." "I understand," he said. "Whatever you need from me, I'll do it. I'll be there." Amara turned back to the window. "I'll believe it when I see it." For now, that was all she would give him, and it was more than he deserved. Daniel sat in the narrow hospital corridor outside the NICU, elbows on his knees, fingers tangled in his hair, the hum of machines and occasional cries of newborns echoing down the tiled hallway. His clothes were wrinkled, his beard unshaven, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. For the past week, his entire life had shrunk to the dimensions of this place. White walls, antiseptic air, and the tiny, glass-enclosed world where his daughter Charlotte fought to survive. Every few hours, a nurse would let him in. He'd scrub in with trembling hands, don a gown, and step quietly to the incubator. Charlotte's body was so small that it almost didn't seem real. Her fingers like threads, her breaths shallow but determined. Wires snaked across her chest, A pulse oximeter blinked faintly beside her, and the soft hissing of oxygen filled the room. But she was alive. She was his. He couldn't touch her at first, not until the doctor said it was safe. The day they allowed skin-to-skin contact, Daniel sat in the NICU chair with tears streaming down his face, cradling her gently against his chest as if she were made of spun sugar. She squirmed slightly, her mouth forming a silent cry, and Daniel whispered to her through a cracked voice, "Daddy's here, sweetheart. I'm here now." Outside the NICU, everything else was falling apart. The penthouse had been listed within days of Charlotte's birth. Daniel hadn't fought it. He couldn't afford to. With the investors gone and his company hemorrhaging credibility, he needed liquidity. Fast. His assets were frozen pending legal review. Lawsuits were stacking like bricks. 3 former business partners accused him of gross negligence, and one angel investor was threatening criminal action over falsified timelines in a tech acquisition Daniel barely remembered signing. He'd never felt more useless, more hollow. Sierra, meanwhile, was doing everything she could to keep herself in the headlines. She sold a second interview, this one televised, a teary-eyed confession where she claimed she'd been emotionally manipulated and lied to about the state of Daniel's marriage. The performance was Oscar-worthy, but public sentiment was starting to shift. Social media turned against her. The same followers who once fawned over her travel photos now called her a homewrecker. Comment sections flooded with vitriol. Sponsorships dropped her. Invitations vanished. Her brand, once built on allure and aspiration, had curdled into scandal and scorn. She called Daniel repeatedly. He ignored every message. The last voicemail she left had a different tone. Bitter, angry, scared. "You think you can cut me off like I'm nothing? I gave up everything for you, Daniel. You promised me a future. You think Amara's going to forgive you? That baby doesn't fix what you did. Don't forget, I know everything about you." He didn't respond. What was there to say? Everything Sierra said only confirmed what he already knew. He had been blind. Not just to what he had, but to what he'd invited into his life. He'd let his ego write checks his soul couldn't cash. And now he was paying. With interest. Still, amid the wreckage, something began to shift inside him. Every night, he read parenting articles on his phone. Every morning, he arrived at the NICU before the nurses changed shifts. He learned to feed Charlotte through a tube. He hummed lullabies with cracked lips and prayed silently while she slept. He even began jotting notes into a leather-bound journal he bought at the hospital gift shop, a journal he intended to give her one day, while a stick-figure family with the words, "Me plus Mommy plus Daddy," scrawled in pink crayon. It made him laugh and cry in equal measure. He cooked dinner, did laundry, read over some code for a freelance project. It was simple, but it was enough. Meanwhile, Sierra Lane had all but vanished from public life. After her media appearances backfired and public sympathy turned, she tried pivoting her narrative. She pitched a tell-all memoir, but publishers passed. One magazine ran a piece exposing her attempts to seduce other wealthy men, using aliases and false credentials. Her name became a punchline in entertainment circles, just another cautionary tale of fame chased and lost. Eventually, she moved out of New York. No one knew where. No one asked. The spotlight she had so desperately clung to had turned cold. In a twist of irony, one of her interviews contained false claims about Charlotte, claims that Daniel's legal team swiftly challenged. A quiet but decisive lawsuit forced Sierra to issue a public retraction. The settlement money, Daniel insisted, went straight into Charlotte's trust fund. The very child Sierra had once tried to erase had, in the end, benefited from her arrogance. Months passed. Charlotte began to talk, to toddle across the living room, dragging her blanket behind her like a cape. She would babble nonsense while pointing at things, declaring her tiny dominion over the world. Daniel documented everything, every milestone, every bedtime story. He filled more journals than he had shelves for. Amara softened slowly, not toward a reunion, but toward acceptance. They started having coffee sometimes during drop-offs. Small talk led to inside jokes, and inside jokes led to conversations about books, work, and dreams they'd had before their lives exploded. Once, during a late-night feeding after Charlotte had fallen back asleep, they found themselves sitting on opposite ends of the couch, just talking. "You know," Amara said, "there was a time when I thought you were the love of my life." Daniel didn't flinch. "I know." She looked at him carefully. "And maybe you were, for a moment. But that moment passed." "I think you were mine too," he replied, voice quiet. "Only I realized it too late." There was no bitterness in her expression, just a calm acceptance, a mutual understanding that some people are meant to change us. As the year drew to a close, Daniel took Charlotte to Central Park. She was bundled in a pink coat, her curls tucked beneath a beanie, her mittened hands clinging to the swing chain as he gently pushed her back and forth. Her laughter rang out into the crisp winter air, sharp and clear. Daniel stood there for a while, watching her, his hands deep in his pockets. He didn't think about the deals he used to close, the headlines, the rooms where people once stood up when he walked in. All of that felt like someone else's life. This life, the one built on humility, fatherhood, and quiet redemption, was infinitely better. Amara arrived a few minutes later, waving from across the park. Charlotte squealed, "Mommy!" and Daniel lifted her out of the swing, carrying her across the field to meet her. They exchanged a glance as she took their daughter's hand. "I'll see you next weekend," Daniel asked. "Of course." He watched them go, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows behind them. And for the first time in a very long time, Daniel Harper didn't feel regret. He felt gratitude. Gratitude for the second chance, not at marriage, not at wealth, but at becoming a man worthy of the title father. He had lost everything, and somehow, through the wreckage, he'd found exactly what he needed. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this emotional journey. If you're still here, it means the story touched something deep inside you, and we're truly grateful for your presence. What can we learn from Daniel and Amara's story? That redemption doesn't come from grand gestures, but from showing up, day after day. That broken trust takes time to rebuild, and sometimes it never does. But even in the ashes of our worst mistakes, there's still hope for growth, forgiveness, and a better version of ourselves. Life has a way of humbling us, but when we strip away the pride, the money, the distractions, what truly remains is love, and the choices we make to protect it. We'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments. Let's build a community that shares stories, learns, and heals together. And if this story moved you, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story. We have so much more to share with you. Until next time, take care and never underestimate the power of a second chance.